Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News Extra, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Health authorities say at least 6 Palestinians have been killed after Israel's military opened fire on several suspects in Gaza. As Hamas tells mediators it will begin transferring 4 bodies of Israeli hostages tonight. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy condemns what he describes as an utterly terrorist and cynical attack by Russia that's injured almost 60 people. The US and China start charging new port fees on each other's ships as trade tensions between the world's 2 biggest economies rise. Now, health authorities say at least 6 Palestinians have been killed after Israel's military said it opened fire on several suspects in Gaza. As Hamas tells mediators it will begin transferring 4 bodies of Israeli hostages tonight. Meanwhile, President Trump has landed back in Washington after attending a global summit in Egypt, where he signed the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire agreement with other world leaders. On his trip back to the US on board Air Force One, Trump also said he hopes it will lead to the rebuilding of Gaza. Take a listen.
Talking about rebuilding Gaza. I'm not talking about single state or double state or 2 state. We're talking about the rebuilding of Gaza.
What's the road ahead for governing Gaza? Because
a lot of people like the 1-state solution. Some people like the 2-state solutions. We'll have to see. I haven't commented on that. That was a power room. Those people, those are the richest countries. I think with tariffs, I think we're the richest country in the world, actually, the United States. We're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars. But those are, really seriously rich countries, and they can handle it.
To discuss this and all of today's stories, I'm joined by columnist and correspondent Gemma White and Managing Director of This Is Dubai, Michael Jabri Pickett. Michael and Gemma, thank you so much for joining me this Tuesday evening. Gemma, let's start with you. There's been a lot of news happening over the last couple of days, and it's been difficult to keep across it all. But last night and yesterday all looked really positive when it came to this deal. We saw Donald Trump's lightning trip to Israel, went to Sharm el-Sheikh. But we now have reports of Israeli gunfire. Has the ceasefire ended before it's even really fully had the chance to begin?
It sort of feels that way, and the optics could make it look that way. We've had this killing of the 6 Palestinians by Israeli gunfire, and not only that, there's reports of about 27 people killed in clashes between Hamas and armed members of the Dugmas clan who are battling Hamas for control of Gaza and the city. Now, the withdrawal of Israeli troops behind the new lines that are being drawn, and the fact that there is just such going to be a clamour for food and resources, it has created a power vacuum in the city that is being filled by really anyone with, an ideology and a gun right now. So there is chaos and there is uncertainty. And I think that this stems from the fact that there is no firm plans in place. There is no, this is going to happen by this date. And that kind of loose plan can sometimes be beneficial because it can allow for flexibility. But in this instance, it's not benefiting anyone. What we need after the ceasefire is, this is a point plan. It's supposed to be a 20-point plan, but we know it was very vague on the actual details and the minutiae. So the ceasefire is looking incredibly fragile, but I think we've seen this before, when there has been a prolonged, war. When the ceasefire does come, it does feel fragile. It can sort of hang by, a hair. or, you know, a trigger. And Trump's words as well, he's not been very concrete in what he's been saying. You know, in Egypt, he said the phases are all a little bit mixed in with each other. Again, we don't want to hear that. We want to hear, hey, this is what's going to happen from now on. And then obviously telling reporters there, which we just saw, again, he finished, we'll have to see. You know, we don't want to see, we want to know. So at the moment, does it look fragile? Yes, because I think it is.
And it's so interesting because Donald Trump has been speaking again today, and he said, if Hamas doesn't disarm, we'll disarm them, perhaps violently, Trump warns, because as you did say, we have seen these clashes break out inside of Gaza, and Hamas also released a video showing street execution of what it calls collaborators, so the different militia that did join Israel or join other forces against Hamas. So things are getting nasty. And another big problem is it's the deceased hostages, and it's finding those bodies. And we know that 4 have already been returned to Israel. 4 will be returning home to Israel this evening. What more do we know, and how is this causing the fragility of the agreement?
So by tomorrow morning, we should be down to 24 dead hostages still being held. But the UN estimates that there's about 54 million tons of rubble in Gaza, which means that this is a process that could take weeks, months, years. One Red Cross official was quoted by Reuters as saying that there might be some hostages that are never found. And as we learn more, we'll start to understand how, and as the hostages speak themselves, how often they were moved. And this is one of the challenges that Hamas was encountering as buildings were being destroyed, and they were trying to move hostages from one place to another. Some, of course, died, and so they were trying to move bodies, but then sometimes I would imagine that bodies would have been abandoned. And so, again, as this one Red Cross official said, that some may never be found. And that, I think, is one of the problems that they're encountering right now, because you have the families of the deceased who want the remains returned, and they don't want a phase 2 to begin until phase 1 is completed. But you don't want what is a technical issue, which is the finding of the bodies, to become a political issue, which means that phase 2 doesn't happen. And it is all very messy, and it's very murky, and there's so much room for interpretation. And the 20-point peace plan is 20 points. It's not a concrete set of we do this, and then this happens, and this happens. And it's one of the challenges I think that you'll find when you're dealing with a terrorist organization. You're trying, it's not as though it's a government that's fallen and has officially surrendered. I think you have an ideology that leads these people in so many different ways, and that is a very difficult thing to bring under control.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's what a lot of analysts are feeling right now and talking about, is how to bring things back under control. But we heard from Israel's far-right security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and we've obviously spoken about him a lot on the show, and he warns of halting Gaza aid if bodies of soldiers are not returned. And we've heard this today, that Israel's saying they're not going to open the Rafah crossing until all the remains are back in Israel, because these families are desperate for their loved ones to be returned. And it's a very difficult situation for those people who are in hostage square day in and day out in Israel, desperate for closure. And then we see the aid blockings, which is very difficult.
But the hostages were the key part of the plan, weren't they? They were literally the number one point on the plan, which was everything hinges on these hostages, dead or alive, being returned to Israel. And if that, even the number one point, is not going to be implemented, there's not really much hope for the rest of it. And as you said, you can't move on to phase 2 or phase 3. And
you're absolutely right. But even from some of the reports that have come out, Hamas apparently had said, the 20 fine, the 20 that are living, but we will have some problems trying to locate all of the deceased.
Yeah.
And I think that there also has to be, it's kind of a give and take. It's a fluid situation, as you said. And, Hamas, we have to assume that they are finally at that point where they're willing to, I mean, they gave up all their leverage, right? Which is the 20 that were alive.
Yeah.
So they obviously want an end to this as well. And you would hope that there could be some sort of a meeting of the minds where it's like, okay, we have to allow time for, the machines to come in, the experts to come in. We have to give it time for the excavation so that we can then hopefully locate the bodies.
And Donald Trump was speaking about those today, urging for the return of the Gaza hostage bodies. And he said a big burden has been lifted, but the job is not done. The dead have not been returned as promised, Trump said on Truth Social a day after traveling to Israel and Egypt. He says phase 2 begins right now. So Donald Trump is really keeping the pressure on Hamas there to make sure these bodies are returned and we do progress through this plan because so much hinges on it. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Stay right there as we move on to another story now. And Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has said almost 60 people have been injured during a Russian attack overnight. He described the attacks, which also hit a hospital in the city of Kharkiv, as an utterly terrorist, cynical attack on a place where lives are saved. It comes as a delegation from Ukraine heads to Washington for meetings this week ahead of Zelenskyy's meeting with Donald Trump, which apparently, Michael, should be happening on Friday. So we know Zelensky's going to be traveling there. We just had this long conversation about the situation in Gaza, Donald Trump brokering that peace plan that we saw, the framework essentially. Do you think he's going to now turn his focus to Ukraine?
Donald Trump is the world's most powerful man. That's the role the President of the United States has. But he's only elected by Americans. And we're in the midst of a government shutdown, which I think is day 13 today. That has to be definitely a priority for him. So would he switch all of his attention to the war in Ukraine? It would be nice if he could devote an awful lot of energy and make sure that there was a meeting of the minds there. I don't think it's going to happen, but I am optimistic that he may recognize that he has a lot more power and a lot more leverage than he thought he had. Because when he did exercise a little bit of pressure on the parties with Gaza and Hamas and the Israelis, it worked.
Yeah.
And the Qataris and the Turks also exercised some pressure on Hamas, and that worked as well. Maybe Donald Trump will recognize he has more power than he thought he did, and maybe he can pressure Vladimir Putin into at least maybe getting to the point where they have a ceasefire.
That would be the hope.
Yeah.
But I think we've never seen Vladimir Putin move his lines. His red lines have stayed exactly where they were when this started back 4 years ago, or even in the Donbass earlier than that. Donald Trump's not been able to shift Vladimir Putin, which is extremely difficult. Are we likely to see the US provide Tomahawk missiles? These have been described as a game changer, Gemma. A lot of focus being put on them. And if so, how will this possibly impact the relationship between Washington and Moscow?
Yeah, I personally do not think we are going to see the sale of these Tomahawk missiles. I think there's too much at stake. I think Moscow is amping up its rhetoric about, well, you don't know what we might do if they get fired, leaving lots unsaid. But I think there is a lot of momentum from what's happened in Gaza. And I do think Trump has actually, I think this has been one of the biggest lessons of his presidency, actually. And I would hope that he takes what he's learnt from that and takes it forward. Now, I think what he will have learnt from it is that it's a multi-country, a multi-nation affair. This is not just America going in and sorting out Gaza. As you said, there were so many different nations involved. And I do wonder if this is a lesson that he can take and start pulling in different nations who have different levels of sway over Russia, different relationships. We're seeing Turkey playing a huge part, and I think they're going to be so important moving forward. I do not think the sale of these missiles will go through. I actually think it's been a bluff from the start, just to kind of see if Putin blinks. But as you've so rightly said, he simply does not. He has the best poker face, you know, of all the presidents, of all the leaders. So I would hope the momentum from Gaza will, you know, keep him going. And obviously the meeting on Friday as well. Yeah, it's very interesting, but I would love to see him take what he's learned, the power that he must feel and the goodwill that he must feel, and then see what he can do with it.
What I do find is interesting is you don't think there'll be the sale of the Tomahawks.
no.
I'm not sure what you think, Michael, but I've been reading into this and I find it quite interesting because, yes, the Tomahawks will be an escalation according to the Kremlin, and they don't want the Tomahawks clearly because Russia does feel that that would be a massive threat to them.
Yeah.
But on Saturday and Sunday, apparently Trump was holding conversations with Zelenskyy regarding the sale of these Tomahawks. Now we're seeing Zelenskyy go on Friday back to Washington. Tomahawks are once again back on the agenda. And I wonder if Donald Trump's thinking, actually, this could be the pressure point to held a big summit with Putin in Alaska, didn't really result in anything. Is this the step I have to take, or is it sanctions?
I think the tricky part with Vladimir Putin is that he won't necessarily come back at you with a tomahawk. You know, you look at what they're able to do with cyber attacks, what they're able to do with drones, what they're able to do with drones over airports, or, you know, the occasional fighter jet into a neighbor's airspace. And it's that constant sort of keeping everybody on their toes. And I think he could ramp that up. And this is the challenge that the EU faces, because they're the ones that are dealing with Vladimir Putin directly, because he's in their backyard. He is unpredictable. He doesn't speak.
Yeah.
You don't get a sense of what he's thinking about. He, as you said, sticks to the same lines publicly. And if he is motivated to think outside the box, which he often does, he might be doing something that the European allies of Donald Trump are 100% not comfortable with. And so the whole idea of the Tomahawks, the sales of those missiles might backfire. But if he does sell them, and if Vladimir Putin does push the envelope, then what? Well, they've got the Tomahawks, then he's got to use them, and that changes the game, and that might not be what anybody wants.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens in that Friday meeting, because we do know that he berated Zelenskyy and all of a sudden he's become more favourable towards Ukraine, Donald Trump. We've definitely seen his attitude change towards Zelenskyy and the plight of the Ukrainians. But I also think it's really interesting when we talk about Russia and sanctions, because we've seen secondary sanctions on the likes of China and on the likes of India, because they're buying oil from Russia. But we mustn't forget Europe buys a lot of oil from Russia too. And I don't think Russia thinks it needs the US so much, because despite all the sanctions on them, they've managed to have a pretty stable economy.
Yeah, the other interesting part about all of that is there are so many other things that Donald Trump has talked about doing with Russia, sanctions, for instance, direct sanctions, but he hasn't. So why go to the Tomahawk missiles as an option when you haven't properly exercised all of the other options? You've talked about them, but you haven't done anything about that. And this is where, again, I've talked about this many times. I think the lack of a clear strategy. If you were to outline what it is that you want from your opponent and what it is that you want to achieve, you could lay out, okay, within the first month, we're going to do this, in the second month, and the third month. And if that fails, then you're at a point where everybody is fully bought into the idea, okay, we're going to amp this up, and Tomahawk missiles are now on the table.
Yeah, he's gone a bit 0 to 60 as opposed to going through all the other potentials. Yeah.
Let's wait and see what happens on Friday, but it's going to be interesting conversations. And if the attention will now turn to Ukraine, let's see what Donald Trump does. Thanks for your thoughts there. Let's move on to another story and to China. And Beijing has announced new fees on US ships entering Chinese ports. The fees follow similar plans announced by President Trump earlier this year and play into the ongoing trade spat between the two nations. Gemma, Donald Trump, the golden thread,
Yes.
China, we've also just spoken about, but tensions still appear to be strained between China and the US. Is this just another tit for tat that we saw over the tariffs, or do you think this could escalate?
I think it's kind of classic tit for tat. And the language is kind of vaguely threatening, but nothing specific and nothing, too outlandish. So we've had Trump applying his tariffs, so China applies their levies. Beijing then announced its plans to tighten control on its rare earth exports, which was met by quite a lot of surprise stateside. Then Trump responded threatening an additional 100% tariff on China. And then most recently, we've got new US tariffs which come into effect on imported timber, kitchen cabinets and upholstered furniture, most of which comes from China. So we just see them, going a little bit higher each time, but nothing that would make anyone kind of become frightened by what they're doing.
We saw the markets become frightened, however, on Friday.
Yes.
People might not be frightened, but the markets had a massive sell-off on Friday when Donald Trump said that possible 100% extra tariff could come in. But what I found was quite interesting, he said that possible tariff could come in on November the 1st, but it wasn't immediate. And do you think that's because he's possibly, or we think, or we know, I don't know what the situation is, but as of now, he's going to meet Xi Jinping in South Korea if that all goes ahead. Do you think we'll get a deal before November the 1st and this could all sort of just chill a bit?
I think Donald Trump likes to build in the buffers. I also think that, as we all know, certainly in this second term in office, that his deadlines are flexible. And so he might want everybody to say, we'll meet and then I'll have a little bit of time to decide. But I don't think that there's any guarantee that the November 1st deadline is hard and fast. And I do think that they will meet. And I don't think anything will really change. There may be more tit for tat between now and the time of the meeting. But Donald Trump has consistently spoken about how he trusts his gut. Before he was meeting Vladimir Putin, he said, within the first 2 minutes, I'll look into his eyes and I'll be able to decide if we're going to have a deal or not. And that, I think, is, at least for him, he feels like that's one of his strengths.
Yeah.
And until he has that opportunity to meet face-to-face with the Chinese president, I think that Donald Trump will sort of remain a little bit quiet or murky with what it is that he could do, and he'll give himself always an off-ramp to take that in case things don't go his way.
But earlier, I actually spoke to economist Laurie Laird. I asked her if a deal can be reached between the US and China. Take a listen to what she told me.
Yeah, I do. I do think there will be a deal to be done. Otherwise, I don't think Trump would have given himself to the 1st of November to actually impose those tariffs. But look, China's exports, despite the already heavy tariffs that they're paying to send to the U.S., China's exports rose by more than 8% year on year in the month of September. While exports to the U.S. fell by 25%, China is starting to divert its exports to other places in the world. So China is showing us, at least for the moment, that they can find other destinations for some of these products.
And that's something China's done so well, because even in Donald Trump's first term, China was the target of tariffs. And he spoke about China a lot when it came to the economy. And it's just interesting when we go back to this conversation about trade deficit and who could possibly benefit from tariffs, because Donald Trump thinks it's going to make America so much money. But we see the political ramifications it can have.
Yeah, I think you have to look at, so 80% of the goods traded around the world are moved by sea. And if you look at the shipbuilding manufacturing industry, last year, in 2024, the United States represented 0.1%, whereas China represented 54%. So China has done a very good job of diversifying. They recognize that their strength is to produce and then ship overseas. And this is one of the areas where Donald Trump, I think, sees that, and he wants some of that for which is the whole reason he's introduced the tariffs. He wants Americans and he wants companies to invest so that America can have some of those manufacturing industries as well. But it's going to take time. And what I think Donald Trump likes to do is have these conversations, certainly with the Chinese president, where, you know, if he can see him face to face, then he can start to get a better sense of what it is that he wants to do. And I think that's where, again, I've said this before, where it's one of his strengths, but I think it's also one of the weaknesses, because I don't know that diplomacy on the world stage should be handled like that.
We know Donald Trump is very transactional. He is a completely different president to before. We know that a lot of diplomacy happens on Truth Social.
Yeah, he's quite heavy-handed.
He is.
Yeah, I've never seen a sort of softly or delicate approach.
I do think, though, what's quite interesting is that Chinese officials met for staff-level talks in Washington on Monday. So there is back-channel negotiation always happening. You know, might see Donald Trump on the front being pretty strong, but I think behind the scenes there's always teams working to make sure that plans are ironed out correctly.
Yeah, and the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent came out and he talked about how there are lines of communication that are still open. So there seems to be some optimism that there are tit-for-tat moves being made now. But I think that that's more posturing. I don't know that that is, although it does frighten the markets, I don't know that that's necessarily going to affect the consumer just yet.
And it's interesting because Scott Bessent actually gave an interview to the Financial Times, and we did see markets slump on his interview, but it was all over the imposed sweeping export controls on rare earths and critical minerals by Beijing, and he said that China was doing it because they were in the middle of a recession or possibly a depression, and that made markets react. And China would argue that they absolutely not. Yes, they had a bit of a housing market downturn, but essentially the economy has picked up. But thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Stay right there as we move on to another story now. And US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth says standards are back after sending home overweight troops. It comes after a picture of Texas National Guard in Chicago went viral last week. Hegseth previously told hundreds of top military leaders that US members needed to be fit, not fat, during a summit in Virginia. I know, I shouldn't smile, I don't know, but you know, there we are, Pete Hegseth, he's back. And I wanted to know, does Pete Hegseth actually have a valid point here?
100% he does, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you are part of the active U.S. military, should you be in fantastic shape? Of course you should. But there's always a conjunction. But in fairness, 3/4 of Americans, according to a study that was published by The Lancet in November of 2024, are overweight or obese. And these are National Guard. These men and women are active 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. I don't know that the same standard should be held for them as it is, for instance, for the senior the senior members of the military that he addressed last month. I think there has to be flexibility, there has to be awareness that while these are men and women who are prepared to be called up, they're not professional soldiers. Certainly they might have been at one point. And I think that there has to be more of an understanding that there is a distinction between an active military soldier serving in South Korea and somebody in the National Guard who's in Chicago.
Gemma, what are your thoughts?
I disagree. I do think if you are going to sign up for something like this, whether the National Guard get paid well, is it a kind of, it's not voluntary, is it? Like
well, it is voluntary that you can serve, and you have to make the commitment, and it's either for 6 or 8 years,
Right.
and then you have this. You'll have like basic training type thing, and then you'll have this sort of commitment.
Yeah.
So you could be called up into when there's an emergency.
Yeah.
But in this particular case, it's
See that
maybe not.
I think if you are putting yourself in that position, you clearly want this role, you could be called up at any time to something quite serious as well, then I think you need to keep yourself in the kind of shape that the role would require. You know, if you're going to be a volunteer firefighter, you would have to stay in tip-top shape because you could be called out to, you know, to the fire at any time. So I do think that you do have a duty to stay in shape. If otherwise, don't sign up for the role.
But I would also say that he doesn't want the fat soldiers. But I don't believe that there is a requirement regarding your height and weight. The requirement is that you have to do certain physical tests.
Yeah.
I'm not being funny, but we've just seen some pictures on screen there, and they could not pass the bleep test. And I think that's a basic test. Well, I don't know. I'm just assuming that they couldn't, because those tests are quite difficult. But I just wanted to go into what happened with Pete Hegseth, because, you know, we've spoken about the administration before, and Pete Hegseth made it really clear when he was addressing the top brass that everyone needed to look great, no beards, you know, very visual, because really we saw the Chinese army come out and do that massive parade, and it was so impressive. It was lockstep, there was nothing sloppy, and if it's the world's strongest army, they need to be on that stage looking absolutely perfection, and that's what Hegseth's trying to say. But it was really the social media post that apparently got Hegseth's back up, because when those pictures went out, one commentator wrote, "Hegseth is going to lose his mind. I'm here for it. Texas National Guard arrives in Chicago for food, I assume."
So I would want to backtrack just a moment, because when I would say that the U.S. military has been proven on many continents over the past 30, 40 years. The Chinese military has not. So while the Chinese military may look fantastic during a parade, there's no evidence that they can actually perform under combat conditions.
And I would agree with that. There's no evidence that they could ever be anywhere as strong as the Navy SEALs, as strong as the US military, undoubtedly some of the best we've ever seen in the world, and that I will agree with. But, you know, for Pete Hegseth, it's also about presentation, and he wants that to be a slick operation.
And they don't want to be laughed at online like that, you know, those jibes and all those funny memes. No, that this is an administration that can't, you know, have a bit of a giggle at all, no.
No, and, you know, Pete Hegseth himself served in the military, and dare we say it, he's in tip-top condition. Gemma, could we see this kind of policy rolled out in other industries?
Do you know what? Before the current administration, I would have said no. But I do feel this administration has made it okay to say and do quite cruel and mean things, and for it to kind of seep into the fabric of society through their supporters, through social media. So, you know, saying things like, "You're very amused by this, I can tell, my goodness."
No, I don't know why.
You know, but were these, you know, troops overweight? Yeah, I think the optics look really bad, to be honest with you. But, and I do believe there are industries where body shape and size and health absolutely do matter, you know, particularly civil defence roles, you know, the police, the fire department, paramedics, armed forces. But in the US, it's interesting. It's not illegal under federal law to discriminate against someone for like height and weight. It's only Michigan who has laws concerning that kind of discrimination. So for private companies, you know, if someone turns up for an interview and you don't like the look of them, you just don't have to hire them. You know, there's kind of nothing telling you that you have to. I do feel that, you know, body acceptance has been very much an online thing, and sometimes we can confuse what's very popular and very noisy online with what's actually happening on the ground. We think, oh right, the healthier any weight and, you know, that kind of movement is actually really big, but it's not. It's kind of online noise, really. So no, I don't think these kind of policies will be rolled out elsewhere. I think it's very much going to be down to like individual companies. But no, I do feel like the administration has made it okay to kind of pick people apart and for it to kind of be seen as all right.
And call people fat.
Yeah.
I think that this administration, they look back on the 1950s for different reasons, as though the golden age of America. Maybe it's a race situation, maybe it's the manufacturing situation, but it's also, and I think we could all agree with this, when you see old photographs or films of PE classes in the 1950s, I mean, these were men and women who were in phenomenal shape.
And they could get up and down a rope very quickly.
Yes.
They were so impressive. Lots of us can't do that nowadays.
No, and they'd be
Absolutely.
vaulting and stuff like this, yeah.
And I think that, you know, there's a bigger issue to be had here, which is, you know, to talk about, okay, Donald Trump is the perfect example of America today. He talks quite openly and is photographed quite openly with his McDonald's.
Yeah.
He loves McDonald's.
Yes, he absolutely does. And that is, I think, indicative of most Americans. And there's nothing wrong with it. But if you're then disappointed as the Secretary of War that some of your men and women are perhaps not looking the way that they should, there is another issue that has to be addressed, which is about the consumption, the amount of food, as well as the processed food that happens in America.
I do think Donald Trump's not going to fight a war, and if you sign up for the National Guard, I would expect peak condition.
But as well, the whole make America healthy again, you know, that's, you would think that would be tied into all of this. That's been a very big message of the administration, but it's been suspiciously quiet as well.
So in that particular case, of course, it's about vaccines and
Food colouring.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Not about actual things that are affecting society, yeah.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Now, it's that time of the show where Gemma and Michael have chosen two of their quirkiest stories. And Gemma, I absolutely love this story because it's badly behaved parents are being banned from children's sporting events. Oh, come on, let the parents cheer them on.
Absolutely not.
No.
As a mother of three, I have seen some behaviours at football matches that would literally make your hair curl, honestly. I've seen parents fighting on a pitch. I've seen parents surrounding a referee.
Out on a Saturday
Absolutely,
night?
yes, you do not. You don't even need Netflix. You just come to a 10-year-old's football match on a Saturday morning. I'll be there, I'll show you. Yeah, so this is in London. The Merton School Sport Partnership. Now, they run a lot of sporting events across the southeast of the city. And they have sent a letter out banning parents from sporting events. Now, this one shocked me the most. This was one of the reasons, because adults have been seen cutting across finish lines of races to impede other children. That is messed up behaviour. And then others shouting abuse towards officials and other children.
Wow.
Ultimately, do kids get into little scraps on the pitch? Yes, they do. These are life lessons to me. It is not then up to a full-grown adult to stride onto the pitch 3 times the size of a child and start yelling at them. But the idea that parents are running into sporting lanes and trying to disrupt the hurdles or disrupt, you know, the 400-metre relay just so that their little one can win is absolutely crazy to me.
Parents gone wild.
Parents gone absolutely insane.
I must say something. I'm not a mum. I don't have children, but I think if I did, I'm so competitive. I'll be running across lines to make sure they
We'd
won.
be like, there's the Anne.
Yes,
The Anne's on the track.
banner.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen some of the, I've seen this on social media where, in America, where there will be jiu-jitsu or wrestling matches that are happening with kids.
Yeah.
And you'll get a parent who steps in and physically assaults the referee. And it's shocking. I'm left speechless.
Yes.
I don't know what you're supposed to say to that.
It's always the referee's fault.
Yes, well, certainly the parents would make it out to be that way.
Yeah, the parents would make it out to be. But I absolutely love that story because I can imagine myself as a parent doing the hurdle scenario. Anyway, Michael, let's move on to
Sticking your foot out as they're going past, yeah.
You know, my baby always wins kind of thing. Michael, let's move on to you because this is such a great story. And of course, it's Halloween, not that far away, and pumpkin season is upon us. And there's been a pumpkin weighing contest in Northern California. Who knew?
So it's the 52nd World Championship of the
Whoa,
pumpkin
not
weigh-off.
just a contest.
No.
This is a championship.
This is a big deal.
The World Series.
Yes.
In America, it's a World Series.
Almost kind of sort of at that level, yes. In fact, Brandon Dawson, who won this year, lost by 6 pounds last year. This year, his pumpkin weighed in at 2,300 pounds. Massive. And for that, he receives $9 per pound, so it works out to $21,114. And this is something that he takes incredibly seriously. He's an engineer, but he puts an awful lot of time into growing his pumpkins. As I said, he lost last year's just by 6 pounds. The world record, though, is held by a couple of brothers in England, and that's a 2,800-pound pumpkin.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
Giant vegetable stories I absolutely love.
I love
and
it.
odd-shaped vegetables.
Oh, yes.
Like, this is fascinating to me.
But I'm just like, how did it get that big?
Yeah.
What fertilizer is he using?
The story, this is an Associated Press story, it didn't get into the details about what it is that he needed
gotta keep
to
that
do.
secret, yeah.
Yes, maybe so. And maybe it is one of those things that you do if you're going to compete on a regular basis. And if there's $20,000 on
Yeah,
it,
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
you're probably not going to share all your secrets.
But I just love that story. I'm also here for the giant vegetables. It's brilliant.
Are they
Thank you.
carving it after? Like, what happens to the giant
Yes.
pumpkin?
Well, you would think, I mean, you do need, for them to put it on the scale, they needed a giant crane. I mean, it's the
Yeah.
size of a small sedan, right? And what they were, I assume, if they could move it back, it would make perfect sense. Either you turn it into pumpkin spice lattes, or maybe you turn it into the world's biggest jack-o'-lantern.
I know, it's so interesting. Or you let it decompose and the next one grow from it. Because it's the giant gene, who knows? But thanks so much to our guests, columnist and correspondent Gemma White and managing director of This is Dubai, Michael Jabri Pickett. And that's all from us on W News Extra. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on X. GNT is coming up next. Goodbye and thank you for joining us.